The Seeking Eye Life Exploration podcast is and will always be free to access. But if you would like to support my work, please consider joining my Patreon or signing up on YouTube as a channel member. By doing so, you will receive exclusive benefits, including early access to future podcast episodes, access to hosted discussion groups, and access to non-podcast supplementary videos. So click the join button underneath this video to join as a YouTube channel member, or find the link to my Patreon page in the description. Thank you.
I'm a professor in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I'm also director of the Center for Mindfulness and Human Potential and acting director of the SAGE Center for the Study of the Mind. I have had a long time interest in consciousness. I think consciousness is really just one of the most interesting things one could possibly study, and it's so interesting because we both are able to study it with some challenges from a third-person perspective, that is through observation and self-reports and experiments, and also first-person perspective on it. And I've studied various different aspects of consciousness, mind wandering, the experience of the mind drifting away from the here and now, as I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with, meta-awareness, the experience of noticing the mind, wandering or anything else where you take stock of the current contents of your mind, memory, unconscious processes, intuition, creativity, the belief in free will, and many other topics.
Sure. Okay, perfect. So let's begin with the main position and kind of your thoughts on it. So the main position would be, we already know that the brain produces consciousness, and that's pretty much all there is to it. It's an epiphenomenon of material processes, of chemical and electrical processes in the brain.
Well, I think that the mainstream has a very firm belief about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the brain. And that belief is sort of rooted in what's known as material reductionism, which is that there's all that there is matter, and everything can be explained in terms of understanding matter. And therefore, there is no possibility of consciousness beyond death, and consciousness is simply a byproduct of this 3.5-pound meatloaf of a brain. And that is the dominant view in the field. And if you even suggest alternative views, you're considered a crackpot and not really a serious researcher who's understand the science. I would say that it is defensible, very defensible, to hold a materialist reduction perspective. That is a ontological view, which I think there's nothing that we know currently that requires you to dismiss it. What I think is not defensible is to say that that is the only defensible metaphysical view, which is the current perspective in mainstream science. And I would direct readers and my colleagues to William James, who is routinely considered to be one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century and psychologists, and is routinely quoted by mainstream researchers when they talk about consciousness, because he had such a really remarkable way of thinking about characterizing, and was just spot on with research in many situations. And William James recognized this material reductionist perspective. He recognized that this was the predominant view in the field, and yet he himself concluded that there were alternatives, and that it was irresponsible of the field to dismiss alternative ways of imagining the relationship between consciousness and physical reality. And I precisely and 100% subscribe to William James's view, and I would recommend that readers who are not familiar with it see his very important and brief essay entitled Human Immortality. And I think it'd be great if you could link that to our conversation. Okay.
Sure. His view was effectively kind of a more of a dualistic point of view, wasn't it? That the brain acts as a reducing valve, or I suppose in modern contemporary understanding, as I usually say, a radio or a transmitter or receiver kind of setting. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And he sort of thought of the brain as like a veil that was sort of shaping some sort of consciousness that to take another metaphor of light shining through it. And the brain is like a veil which is shaping this incoming light. And so changes to the veil, of course, are going to change what comes through. So just because we see this relationship between the brain and the qualities of consciousness doesn't mean that the brain is the generator of consciousness.
So similar to how if you have white light shining into a prism, that can then kind of focus it into various different wavelengths that you wouldn't be able to see otherwise, that kind of idea.
Exactly, yes.
Sure. So I'd imagine many people would say, well, William James lived in a time where the understanding of the brain and neuroscience was far more restricted to what it is now. So would his views still be relevant in light of the correlatory evidence of brain mind that we have now?
Well, he's very aware, and he discusses in this essay that there is a relationship between the brain and consciousness. And of course, that was known at the time because when you had challenges to the brain, you saw changes in it. And there was an understanding that the brain processing was associated with consciousness. I would be very interested to hear what it is that they think they've discovered since the time of William James that has led them to be able to entirely dismiss a transmitter view of consciousness. So I'd be very, very interested in saying that. Yes, we see that areas of the brain are activated. We see a loose correlation. We don't even see a perfect correlation. It's far, imagery is far from perfect. But even if there was a perfect correlation, that still doesn't mean it's generating. You could imagine a perfect correlation between the characteristics of the veil and what comes through, and that doesn't mean that it's necessarily the source of the experience itself. So I think that researchers are taking a ontological stance and making essentially their axiom a conclusion from their findings.
One argument that I saw actually quite recently within the last few days, which was quite interesting, is the argument that in order to have a solid theory of something, then you need to be able to give future testable predictions to those. And the argument would be that a materialist view of brain and consciousness has been able to do that, whereas a dualistic has not. For example, one prediction could be made that we will find a physical mechanism that can act as the transceiver to this non-physical consciousness, and yet that hasn't been found. So therefore, a physicalist perspective is more evidenced and more of a strong theory due to that predictive capability. What would you think to that?
Well, I think that you can simultaneously do all the same predictions with the veil perspective, that it is simply a transmitter, than you can with we don't know the source of consciousness whatsoever. Until we understand, if we had some evidence for the source, then perhaps that would be the case. But all this talk of finding the source, and even understanding what it would mean to find the source, like what would be the evidence that would show you that you now know that consciousness is materially grounded. I think it's very plausible that consciousness is intrinsic to material at all different levels, the panpsychic perspective, and that leads to a very similar assumptions as to a materialist view. So basically what's happening is they're taking a ontological stance that is a metaphysical worldview about the nature of reality, which doesn't lend itself to experimental discernment. And so therefore it leads to multiple alternative perspectives. And they're taking one particular take on that. It's very much like, just to take another example, the anthropic principle, and which I'm sure you're familiar with, your listeners are familiar with, which is basically, why is it that everything is perfectly suited for consciousness in this world? And there are three really viable alternatives. One alternative is that there's the multiple universe, and that's the prevailing view, that if you had enough different opportunities, and some of them are going to show up this way. Another possibility is really lucky. It just so happened that all the parameters that had to happen happened the way they did. And then the third possibility is that there's some sort of intelligence, not necessarily God. There's probably an infinite possible ways in which intelligence might be in the fabric of the cosmos that led it to be this way and not some other way. Or consciousness itself is a fundamental element. All three of those are really kind of preposterous, right? The notion that there's this infinite number of other universes that we have absolutely no evidence for. Where's the empirical evidence for that? The notion that we're just incredibly lucky that of all possible ways that the world happened, it's this way. Where's the evidence for that? And the possibility that there's some intelligence. Well, I mean, they're actually you could say that you could see evidence of intelligence in terms of the way in which the complexifying seems to happen so dramatically, where it's not obvious that would need to be. But leaving that aside, there's no evidence, no empirical evidence for that either. So it's choose your poison. And to say that one of them is clearly the prevailingly correct view based on the known evidence, I think is presumptuous. The same argument goes for consciousness and its relationship to the material world. Yes, it's defensible. You are entitled to believe that you are just a bunch of mud that's activated in a particular way, and that there's nothing special about consciousness that distinguishes it in any way from any other matter. But that's not the only way to think about it. And to say it is, I think, is arrogant, presumptuous, and not scientific. It's not the scientific way to assert as axioms things that are to assert as findings things that are really your axioms.
And my position currently on the question is very similar, if not identical to yours, that the idea that consciousness is an emergent property of material processes through the evidence of correlation can also be, as you say, equally evidence to a non-physical approach. And I would say more evidence in light of anomalous experiences, veridical perception in out-of-body experiences, evidential mediumship, psi phenomena, etc. So I would argue that maybe not necessarily a dualistic position, but a non-brain production theory of consciousness is in fact more evidenced by this phenomena. Although generally it's seen that these phenomena are often discounted as anecdotal or poorly researched or poorly concluded research.
Well, I have this expression that I've been using lately, conservation of skepticism. And it's a curious thing. They were studying psi effects back at the time of William James, who was also a proponent of those types of phenomena. And the curious thing is that those phenomena have neither been able to be substantiated, in an absolutely rigorously empirical way where you can replicate them with pre-registered studies, nor have they been dismissed. There's so many anecdotal examples and scientific findings that then don't replicate, but the original studies were done appropriately, and funnel meta-analyses suggest that it wasn't just that only the ones that worked were published. So there's this curious thing where, I'm sorry?
Sorry, just good to clarify, that's the file drawer effect, isn't it?
The file drawer effect, that's right, yeah. And it's not clear that you can dismiss these, but you could possibly, but it's not like self-evident that these can be dismissed based on file drawer fraud or the other alternative accounts. So there's this curious thing where we can either show it or put it to rest. And I rather suspect that that's not just sloppy science on one side or the other, that there may be something, some sort of, maybe it's related to the lack of transmission that you find in with Bell's theorem type of situation. We can go into that, but that there may be some sort of principled reason why these things happen, and yet they aren't demonstrable at a large scale in a replicable way. So I think that the materialists have a point when they say, show me the well-replicated pre-registered studies that work. And until you do, I'm not going to believe it, because those don't exist. There's always some sort of challenged, and maybe there'll be some new breakthroughs, but I've been tracking the literature pretty closely, and the more pre-registered a study is, and the more times it's replicated, the less likely it is to show up, even though the original studies were done well, and there's reason to believe them. So I kind of lean on your side, in part because of those kinds of things, although I'm reticent because I just, in my heart of hearts, and I'm actually involved in some large scale psi studies. In my heart of hearts, I think the more people are involved in the evaluation, the less likely you are to make it work.
So could you just briefly clarify for those that aren't familiar what a pre-registered study is?
Yeah. So this is a really important advance in scientific research, where prior to doing your study, you articulate precisely what your predictions are, how you're going to analyze the data, what exclusion principles you're going to use, and so on. And then whether or not your finding is considered to be significant depends on if you find statistical significance when you follow your pre-registered design. And this is so important because what can happen is people run a study and it doesn't work the way they thought it would work, but it worked this other way, or it worked yet some other way, or if you covary out some particular variable, or just look at some subset of conditions and so on. And this is very important because what's been found is that if you give researchers freedom to sort of try analyzing it one way and try analyzing it another and try analyzing it a third, with enough different possible ways of analyzing it, they can often find statistical significance even in just sort of random data. So the pre-registration is really important. And it must be said that there are very few, if any, pre-registered replicated studies. Now, what does happen sometimes is people will pre-register a study, run it, and then it works. But if you run enough studies, some of the ones that you pre-register will work. What you need to do is pre-register it, run it, it works, and then pre-register the same analysis again and see if that worked. And to my knowledge, there's not been a pre-registered replication that has succeeded in the psi research. But I would be very open if people could introduce me to those studies, and it's important that we keep trying.
And why was it you said that the reasons given as to why that may be the case?
So I have this view, and this is going to be a view that nobody is going to like, because it's sort of challenging both to the anomalous cognition community and also to the mainstream community. And I should say, right before I say anything more, my motto is entertaining without endorsing. And I think that this is really a critical space that people should consider residing in, where you entertain the alternative possibilities. And the fact that you're entertaining them does not mean that you're endorsing them is necessarily the case, just like, let's consider this as a possibility. And so I certainly entertain the material reductionist perspective. I want to be clear on that. I think that is defensible. What's not defensible is to say that's the only defensible perspective. I definitely entertain a more dualist or idealist perspective as well. But one thing that I think may fall out from some of these higher level perspectives, especially the idea that that if there's anomalous things, that there may be anomalous elements or constraints at the level of the observer itself, at the level of the scientific discipline of intersubjectivity. And the basic idea is that the more observers you have, the less opportunity you have for being able to see these anomalous effects. So as a single individual, we experience them, but as we combine ourselves with other observers, we experience them less. And when we can combine ourselves with the entire community, then we have less room. You can kind of think of it like the difference between a tugboat and an ocean liner, right? A tugboat has got a lot of maneuverability. An ocean liner has much less. It really can't turn on a dime. And my theory, which kind of falls out from the notion that we're all have some wiggle room in what I call alternative time is that when you line up lots of observers together, as you do when you pre-register, as you do when you replicate multiple times, that you then lose the degree of freedom to be able to see these anomalous things. So the what will likely be a very unpopular sort of byline is magic is local. You get these things, but really just at the local level.
So you say that you're involved quite substantially with some psi experimentation, psi research. What kind of things are you working on, and what have you found?
So I've found findings which I don't need to go into, but they've never replicated. So the same type of thing that you might expect from what I was saying. Right now, I'm involved in a large-scale study that involves 7 different labs where we are all co-investigating the Gansfeld paradigm, which is a paradigm of telepathy in which you have a sender and a receiver. And it's the most widely, allegedly replicated psi paradigm. And we're doing it very, very rigorously, cameras in every room, all the data going to a common location, all mainstream researchers who have credibility, and we'll see what will happen. But what's interesting is that although all of these researchers think this is an important subject, all of them actually suspect that it's not going to replicate when we do this. Even though many of them think that there is a phenomena here, it just somehow, when you do things exactly rigorously, and in my view, with the connection to lots of observers, the effect dissipates. I would not be surprised if we observe what has been called the decline effect, where the effect is there, but then as it's replicated, it disappears. And of course, the decline effect also falls out from this notion that with more observers, these kinds of anomalous things dissipate.
So with this problem of replication, how would psi phenomena make its way into being accepted as a genuine phenomenon if, by its very nature, it's difficult, if not impossible, to replicate accurately?
I don't think it ever, to be honest, I don't think it ever will. I think that this is the conservation of skepticism. I think that it's kind of like God or immortality or free will, perhaps even. It's going to ultimately be a matter of one's own metaphysical views, that you can interpret the same set of studies, the same set of findings, the same personal experiences through different lenses. I mean, when people say that their consciousness is nothing more than physical events, they're interpreting their amazing qualia, which we have no idea how that could be a physical thing, and they're interpreting that as being just exactly the same thing as this table, and that's a metaphysical leap which they're making there. From my perspective, the strongest evidence for idealism or dualism is the predominance of consciousness over physicality in the first place. But it's ultimately, I think, going to be not a scientific question. What science needs to recognize is that they're taking a metaphysical stance and dressing it up as a scientific finding. And what I think could happen is that people will come to realize that science doesn't have, is not a priest or a rabbi or it's acting like it, but it's not. It doesn't have it doesn't have any more ontological insight into the nature of consciousness than any of these other religious traditions do. It's fine to adhere to it, just like it's fine to adhere to any other religion, but to say that this is the only one that's right is comparable to insisting that your religion is right and everybody else is wrong, and you know that for a fact.
And why do you think the materialist view is therefore the most adhered to, without the consideration of other possibilities?
Most adhered to. It's of course it's the most adhered to in the scientific community, but it's hardly adhered to in the mainstream. In the mainstream, it's quite the opposite. People who are considered atheists are considered immoral. I mean, there's a whole, the whole other side is equally, terrible, where people think, if you don't believe in my God, then you're not a moral person. You're not a good person. I don't trust you. So it's adhered to because there's this false assumption that because science has been successful in engineering and all these other ways, and it actually really hasn't been very helpful. It's interesting how little neuroscience has contributed, by the way, to helping with mental health. It's a real paradox there. But even though it's been helpful in medicine and various other situations, therefore there can be nothing more. To think of anything more is lacks parsimony. But of course, consciousness, they haven't explained consciousness. To say that it's parsimonious, the materialist reductionist approach is parsimonious, it requires sweeping a consciousness under the rug. It also requires sweeping some other major things at the moment, like the flow of time and the privileged present and free will. All these things, all like the most fundamental aspects of our lived existence, get swept under the rug in order to maintain the materialist reduction perspective.
And in that case, the argument would be that all phenomena that we've experienced or considered mysterious or magical or divine in the past has been determined materially or physically, and therefore it's most reasonable to consider that consciousness will be as well in the future, the so-called promissory materialism.
Yeah, and I think that is defensible. But here's the thing that I worry about. I worry that they're going to conclude that they understand consciousness, particularly if they can emulate it with, say, AI, and then they're going to think it's possible that they'll be able to create an AI which basically says it's having your experience and it's acting just like you, and everyone's gonna just sort of pass the reins onto these AI zombies that don't actually have any consciousness at all. So the prevailing view that we're just material reductionist things, and therefore anything that if it quacks like a duck, it is a duck, could lead to ironically, the extinction of consciousness, as we're willing to give up biological experience for some other sort of emulation of it that we don't understand. So in principle, the problem is that when you conflate observational findings for an understanding of consciousness, you run into the real risk of doing of misleading people in really major ways.
Now, time is a phenomena that you've researched heavily into, I know, and one that I have not, because as I say, my main interest is life after death, which could be related to time to some degree, but loosely. So the more kind of direct understanding of time at the moment is from obviously Einstein's perspectives that that time is a physical kind of, it's not a concept, because we can bend time. We can, the closer we get to a black hole, the more time becomes dilated. And that's the general view. So what are your ideas on time, and how do they differ from that?
So if you take it from a subjective perspective as a first pass, I think that it is not unreasonable to imagine 3 dimensions of time. And I've made the argument that 3 dimensions of time also may have some relevance to existing physics. But let's just sort of think it through. And what I'd like to do is to create in your mind a visualization of it, so you can play with it for yourself. And I would invite others to do the same and sort of mess with it. And you can find a video on the Essentia Foundation of my work that discusses this in more detail. In any case, imagine that you are a window moving through time, okay? And there are actually 3 dimensions of time. So we first have the standard dimension, which is objective time, so that's forward. And then we have 2 additional dimensions. Up is subjective time. And so the idea is that our consciousness is always moving with some vector in objective relative to subjective time. And so if you go completely straight, if the vector is exclusively in objective time, it's as if you're under anesthesia. You have no experience whatsoever. If it goes straight up, it's as if the clock stops. Perhaps this is what happens when people die. They may just have exclusively a vector in subjective time. Like this would be like a car accident where time seems to go very slowly. And like this might be a very deep conversation where time just zips by. And we always have some, we're always moving in objective time relative to subjective time. And both of them have, I mean, if you think about it, subjective time is at least as important as objective time. I'd rather have experience a lifetime. Sorry, I'd rather experience what felt like a lifetime but lasted a minute than what felt like a minute but lasted a lifetime. It's all about subjective time. So those are the first two dimensions. And then the third dimension, you can imagine this sort of going like this, is alternative time. And basically, this is where free will comes in. And it's the idea that every next moment we can through directing our consciousness, we can actually realize alternative next moments in time. And each one of us has this vector in alternative time. And this is where the wiggle room comes in my view. This is where the magic happens, synchronicities, all the cool stuff that I think may be localized to the individual or just to a few individuals, and that's why they decline over time. That's in this alternative time dimension. Now, the final move is rather than imagining us moving through time, time is moving through us, and we're all basically tethered together in this what I call kite of consciousness, where we all have our little sail. Time is moving through us, and each one of us has our little bit of wiggle room, which impacts the movement potentially of the whole kite. So it also sort of shows the way in which we're all moving together. We all have our own little bit of room, but if there is any magic, it's all happening at the local level.
So how has this theory kind of been integrated, or how has it been taken by other scientific views and other philosophical views?
Largely ignored. There's Bernard Carr has a very similar view, and he's also been largely ignored. I have to say that that's in part because I haven't. That's in part because it's not formalized in the way that the mainstream would require. So in many ways, it's sort of more philosophical than it is empirical at the moment. But also, I've not been energetically pursuing it. I have a large lab, and we do a lot of mainstream research on important topics such as curiosity and creativity and mind wandering. So this is a little bit of a sideline, but I am hoping to put more energy into it in creating more and more understandable visualizations of it, because I think that once you see it and you can sort of play with it, it begins to take on more merit.
I can see that a nice animated diagram would put a lot of that into a much closer perspective, much more understandable perspective for sure.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the Hameroff and Penrose Orco-R theory of consciousness? Are you familiar?
Yeah. I think it is a viable theory. I think that the argument that quantum effects can't happen in warm brains is, again, it's presumptuous to say that we understand how brains work or how quantum effects work. I think that the notion that the microtubules might be sort of the ideal place for these effects to occur is got merit, is plausible. It's outside. I don't have the authority to be able to evaluate that entirely, but I think ruling it out seems premature. I think there is a number of interesting examples of situations which appears that quantum effects may be happening in biological systems. Certainly photosynthesis, the evidence for it happening in birds' eyes, and Hameroff has a number of other areas of evidence. So I think it's definitely deserving of entertaining, even though wouldn't say I necessarily endorse it. But more broadly speaking, I think it's the kind of theory that we need more of. It's a theory which is really trying to imagine consciousness having a sort of fundamental properties that interact with the physical universe, and trying to imagine what those properties might be. So as an example of the kind of um, uh, less material reductionist perspective, because it has Platonic elements to it, I think it's really noteworthy.
And I suppose one other theory that I'm less familiar with is often cited as a more material-based one is the integrated information theory. Do you know much
It's actually not really. I would disagree with it. It treats consciousness as a fundamental. So it denies the claim that consciousness can emerge from other material things. I think it's notable that it's crossed over into the mainstream. It's especially notable because it's crossed into the mainstream. There are two different meetings: the science towards the science of consciousness meetings, and then the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness. And these draw different people, and that latter group, they don't let in any quantum stuff. They don't let in any parapsychology stuff or anomalous cognition stuff. They are the hard-nosed scientists, but they are willing to consider integrated information theory, which is why you're characterizing it as materialist, because it does have, it is grounded in some ways, but because it takes consciousness as a fundamental, I would argue that it's really not reducing consciousness to material.
So from all the different theories of consciousness that you've come across, you say that you lean more on the side of kind of more of a dualistic perspective as opposed to a material one. So what is it that differentiates, or what's that differentiation factor for you that leads you more that way than the other?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily, it's hard for me, I wouldn't necessarily say I lean dualist, although I certainly entertain dualists. I lean towards some version of dualism or panpsychism or idealism. Some theory which treats consciousness as fundamental, if not more fundamental, than material things. And that's increasingly being entertained by the mainstream. So it used to be that panpsychism and idealism just get laughed, out of town, and now they are laughed out of town by many people. But there are some serious-minded people who are going, "That's interesting. We really have not cracked the consciousness nut at all." These are intelligent people. Bernardo Castro, David Chalmers, Christoph Koch now even is leaning in this direction. Stuart Hameroff, arguably Penrose. These are some serious thinkers who are, at a minimum, entertaining, if not, endorsing these non-materialist perspectives.
And why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's because it's right. It's right that we don't have a closure on our ontology of the nature of consciousness. And if you just think about it hard, you recognize that to just say this has been made clear and to treat as an axiom something which is your own personal assumptions is just, it's just not logically sound. So I think people are thinking hard about it, and they're realizing that yes, I may have a conviction, I may be an atheist, material reductionist, but I, in all fairness, have to recognize that the only really defensible position is being agnostic, and recognizing that there are other defensible positions, and I might not have a taste for them, but but I can't rule them out entirely. And once you just let in a crack of a possibility that some of these other alternatives might be available, that's a huge change, right? If you go from infinitely impossible to possible, that's a big jump. And once you make that jump, then you can start entertaining, and then you go, well, maybe that's not quite as crazy as it happened. I think it's also possible, certainly in the case of Crystal Cook, psychedelics played a role, that people have experiences of realer than real, where they they feel like they understand consciousness in a way that changes their relationship to physical reality, near-death experiences. I think it's possible that podcasts like yours and the democratization of information in ways that make it accessible to people, I think all those things may be playing a role. Of course, there's also this more trend. So there was behaviorism. We weren't even allowed to talk about thinking 50 years ago. So there's been a real sort of opening to looking at internal life. And as we look at internal life, that also helps us to consider the ways in which we don't understand it in the same way that we understand the external world.
One of the most cited kind of arguments for a material basis over a consciousness being fundamental basis is in that case, why do Alzheimer's diseases and things like that, why do they cause memories to be lost, or why does indeed anesthesia eliminate apparently consciousness experience? Because if it's fundamental, you would expect that to not be affected, at least the sense of awareness, not necessarily the content of.
Yeah, that makes no sense to me at all. I mean, if you take the veil metaphor, you're just changing the shape of the veil, and with a thick enough veil, nothing gets through at all. And there's also, things like terminal lucidity, which it's kind of hard to explain from a material reductionist perspective. Also, if they're laying claim to the idea that the brain has become so dysfunctional that it's not able to do these things anymore, why all of a sudden do people seem to at the very end of life seem to gain a level of cogentness that they lacked for some time? I mean, there are ways to explain that in a brain way. I'm not saying that that proves anything. It's just the argument that it proves that this is impossible. That's the part that I question. The view that you couldn't interpret this from another perspective. And they might say, well, where's the really well computational theory of a sort of the Jamesian thing? And I think it's possible that there could be a computational theory. I actually think the three dimensions of time and the notion that we're actually windows moving through a subjective dimension of time could be codified in a quantitative way. But of course, the mainstream is profoundly discouraged young, bright minds from taking that route, because they're going to be considered crackpots and not sober scientists.
Yeah, and even from a more day-to-day, experiential take, it would mean getting work as a reputable scientist would be harder. Getting funding for research projects would be harder if one held that view, which I know has happened a lot, unfortunately.
Yeah, there's a real marginalization to people who articulate these types of views. And so there are many people I know for a fact through private conversations who entertain these ideas privately, but would never admit them publicly because of a concern that this would marginalize them and reduce their availability for funding and tenure and promotion and publications and so on.
Which is unfortunate, because that is, in my opinion, against the very tenets of science, which should be open to new evidence and open to change. But I think a lot of people seem to conflate science with materialism as opposed to what it is, a method, of developing knowledge. And I often see also conflated the ideas of things like life after death, the belief in life after death, and non-material based consciousness with religion. So if you believe in life after death, that must be because you're subscribed to a certain religion or etc. Whereas I would argue that all these questions are a matter of science, and it's going to be discovered through science, but not through the current iteration of the scientific method.
Well, I think that for sure that that it's valuable, as I'm indicated, to use the scientific method in pursuit of exploring these types of questions. And of course, there are examples of this. There's the research on reincarnation at University of Virginia, and IONS has been looking at channeling in Edinburgh, and there are little pockets of researchers around the world who are doing these types of studies. And I think it's very valuable to do that. But I still caution the view that science is going to be able to turn the table and be able to show, no, look, now we've shown that the consciousness is more than that. That would be great. There have been things like Bell's theorem, which and then the studies that followed it, which basically showed a non-locality. And it would be amazing if something like a non-locality were demonstrated for anomalous things. And I urge the researchers to continue to look for that. But I do also feel that there's this real possibility that there's something baked in to sort of the way that the world exists that we'll never be able to conclusively show these things. It'll always seem anecdotal, and the more rigorously we try to test it, the harder it may be. But I hope I'm wrong about that. I think it would be really cool if some sort of conclusive evidence could be found, but that's my hunch.
And it's been attempted, certainly recently, with Sam Parnia's work with the AWARE studies. So I don't know how much time we've got, but just to kind of finish off with the questions, what do you think about the evidential value of experiences such as veridical near-death experiences, evidential mediumship, remote viewing, past lives to some extent, etc., despite not having this grounded empirical base and, as we were saying with the Parnia studies, no successful example of non-local awareness?
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect example, right? There are all these anecdotal examples of people having access to information in near-death situations that they shouldn't have had access to, and yet when they try to really rigorously tie it together with this pre-registered, carefully done thing, you don't see it, and that shows the exact rub that I suspect is there. From my perspective, it really allows individuals to sort of embrace the evidence as works with them. Some people are going to see all these cases of all the different things that you listed off and go, of course there's consciousness is more than that, and they'll have a justification for that. They can use that to inform their belief. Others will say, but where's the hard evidence? Where's the pre-registered? Why didn't that study work? Until you show me something like that, I'm not going to believe it. And that's a defensible perspective as well. And I suspect that this capacity to maintain skepticism for either side and just to be able to go with one's own personal intuitions is going to be the way things are sustained. And maybe that's for the better. Maybe it's okay that we don't prove it one way or the other, and it allows people to be able to sort of approach the world with their finding their own ontology for themselves instead of having science force it on them.
Sure. And I think it's important, the word skepticism and the label of skeptic has been vastly, I think, misused recently to mean disbelieving or doubting or debunking anything that's not in the current mainstream idea, rather than what I believe it to be is being strictly in the middle and being open but critical of both areas. That's kind of where I try to sit.
Precisely. Skepticism is actually been co-opted to mean dogmatic material reductionism. And that's not, if a true skeptic would apply skepticism to dogmatic material reductionism as well. And somehow the skeptics have lost sight of that very obvious point. And what we need to do is to cultivate a new generation of people who are able to entertain without endorsing positions on all sides of the ontological debate.